From the University of Toronto's Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy, this is the I'm Pharmacy podcast. I'm Mina Tadrous. Drugs are not innocuous. The decision to use them is an often calculated risk-benefit calculation. How we think about risk has always fascinated me. Risk is often theoretical, something that can occur and will occur far off. More importantly, risk is never standalone. It is always measured against the potential benefits. We measure it against the inconvenience and the perception of what may occur. More importantly, risk is not always logical, no matter how much we measure it. And this was always boggling to me. As a person who loves to count things and measure them, I always found it interesting that no matter how much information I presented somebody with, they may not follow the same path of thinking I did. I naively believed if people were presented with the right information on risk and benefit, they could easily come up with the right choice, or what I thought to be the right choice. Let me walk you through an example I commonly saw in the pharmacy. A drug could have a 50% effectiveness of lowering your cholesterol, but have a side effect that happens 1 in 10,000 people. And the patient would still decide that this was not enough benefit to overcome that risk. So how do they think through this? Some of it is extremely logical. They feel there's a lack of information, perhaps there's no long-term studies. The risk feels uncertain versus the benefits seem not worth it. More importantly, the risk feels much more certain when you choose to take something rather than not take it at all. What I mean by that is that the moment they take that pill, the likelihood of having that risk or that side effect instantly becomes infinite compared to before when they had zero chance because they didn't even take the pill at all. More interestingly, some things are a bit more gray. There is a general distrust of how we study safety. And I can't blame people. How could they forget some of the stories of corruption and greed? Stories like Vioxx and Avandia, with companies hiding data or misleading prescribers. These stories overshadow stories of discontinued drugs, drugs pulled from the market, or even stories about how we've changed the way we use drugs as we've gotten more information. And this stands in the face of what we learned last episode, that trials are the gold standard of evidence. So why do we always find out about safety issues after the trials, after they've been released to the market? And how do we ignore these safety issues when we're thinking about that risk-benefit ratio? So that's what I want to explore today. How do we study the safety of drugs? Who studies them? And what does that mean to our risk tolerance of medications? To learn more about drug safety, I spoke with Dr. Tara Gomes. She's a pharmacoepidemiologist who studies real-world drug safety. To do so, she leverages routinely collected data housed at ICS. ICS is a global leader in using real-world data, and it's right here in Toronto. The power of ICS and the data that they hold is the ability to link things across. I want you to envision every visit to a hospital within the province of Ontario, a doctor's office, a pharmacy, or even the emergency room. And by connecting all of those things, we can better understand what's actually happening in the real world. Here's Dr. Gomes.
My name is Tara Gomes. I am a scientist at Unity Health Toronto and ICES, and also an assistant professor at the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy and IHPME at the University of Toronto.
So where would you kind of describe your research fitting into the life cycle or like the life of a drug?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting place in that, a huge amount of resources and time and effort goes into developing drugs and running randomized controlled trials to understand if they work and if there are major safety concerns. But once that all happens and a drug is approved and released into the world for people to use, there's often a lot of information that's missing in terms of whether there are certain benefits or risks to different subsets of the population. So my work really fits into that time period after a drug is approved. It's been shown to be safe and effective in clinical trials, and now it's being prescribed in the general population. And there are a lot of opportunities there to understand what then happens in that real world setting.
So maybe we can walk through an example. Like let's paint a picture of an example of a drug that maybe you've researched previously. It just came out of clinical trials. It's about to enter the market. Like where would your work enter in? I don't know, maybe you can actually pick an example of a drug that you've done this with.
Yeah, so we did a study. Actually, you were involved in that study as well and led it, so you know this very well. But we did a study looking at Xolair, so omalizumab, and what happened once it was being prescribed in a real world setting, because this drug was expensive and but shown to be efficacious in clinical trials. And so one of the things that policymakers are often grappling with is how do they provide access to a medication like that, because they want to make sure that they are really getting the bang for their buck, that when they are reimbursing a medication like that, once it's being provided in a broader setting, that those effectiveness outcomes, so those outcomes and those benefits of that drug over existing medications that might be cheaper, are really playing out in the real world. And so we did a study looking at all people who were newly started on Xolair once it became available and was being funded by the ministry in Ontario, and follow people forward to better understand, what their hospitalization rates were for, asthma related reasons, what their use of other medications was, and what their healthcare costs were over time, and compared them to people who also, were very similar clinically and by age and sex, but were not accessing this newer agent. And so then we were able to see whether or not the benefits that had shown through in a clinical trial setting were actually being seen when a medication was rolling out into that broader population-based setting.
So, and did you guys find that it worked as well? This is so strange for me. So, we basically, like, we could just talk, this is the first interview where I'm actually involved in this research. So, interestingly, like we found that in some groups it didn't work well. Like, why would that, like, is this a common occurrence with drugs that you found that in the real world, they don't work as well? Or maybe they, it leads sort of to the question of what happens when things come out into the real world.
Yeah. And that's exactly what is so interesting about this area of work, is that, the study didn't really show that people who were getting this medication were doing that much better than the comparator group, but they were costing a lot more money because they were getting this very expensive medication. I think what it shows is that, as we know, clinical trials are often run in very tightly restricted populations, those who are most likely to benefit from that medication. Whereas once it's rolled out at a population level and being prescribed, in clinical practice more broadly, often you see that the people who are accessing that medication are much broader in terms of their clinical comorbidities and their likelihood of benefiting from that medication. So I think the reason we didn't see anything is that there may have been a small subset of people who did benefit, but those effects were drowned out by the fact that this medication, the Xolair, was being prescribed even more broadly than what we saw in the clinical trial setting. And so for many people, they perhaps didn't actually get the benefit out of the drug compared to what they would have been prescribed otherwise.
So this is a really nice segue to this idea of like, when we think about studying drug safety. So in this example, we were studying like how well it worked, and partially it was a little bit about safety, but a lot of people point to the fact that when drugs come out, they suddenly start hearing all these warnings. And I think people who aren't familiar with this space will point to that as an example of pharmaceutical companies rushing drugs out, or perhaps like the government not doing their due diligence. Is that, do you feel like that's sort of the case, or is it like for a lot of these safety signals and things that we study, what's happening there? Like if you were to explain this to sort of the lay public, what's happening with the safety in this sort of phase 4 of the drug life?
That's a great question. I would say for the most part, I think that the drug companies and the clinical trials that are done are, done following very rigorous, well-established methods, and they are really designed to try and determine both efficacy but also safety. And so I don't think that when we see some of these signals, it's suggestive of, rushing something through or not following appropriate protocols. But oftentimes the adverse events that you might see in those safety signals happen in a pretty small population. And so within a fairly small sample size in a clinical trial, you might not see that safety signal arise. Whereas once you provide that medication across a large population, you might start to see clusters of certain outcomes that start to raise questions about safety, and maybe safety only in certain subpopulations. So certain populations that have kidney disease or who are older or who have multiple comorbidities who may not have been part of a clinical trial, but are now accessing the medication outside of that really highly controlled setting. So I wouldn't say that it is, evidence of poor quality drug development or clinical trials, but more so the fact that we just have to recognize that you cannot do everything within a clinical trial setting. You can do the best that is possible to determine if a drug is effective and to identify any safety signals that are apparent. But there's always going to be a really important role of population-based real-world evidence once medications are rolled out into that public domain to try and continue to understand where there is most benefit for a medication and where there might be opportunities to improve its safety or restrict the populations who might access it to make sure that they're not exposed to increased harm.
This dynamic between clinical trial and observational studies seems central to ensuring drug safety. To further explore this, I spoke with Dr. David Juurlink, who's an internist and clinical pharmacologist at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center and a scientist at ICES. And I don't know if I've ever told you this, Dave, but so your PPI clopidogrel paper is actually what launched me into my career. So when I was a trainee in my residency, I was moonlighting at a community pharmacy in Memphis, Tennessee. And I walk into the hospital that morning and we're switching every patient on clopidogrel and omeprazole off. And I was like, what the hell is going on here?
My bad. Yeah.
And they were
2009.
like, and they were just like, oh, this study out of Canada came out. And I grew up in Toronto, but I didn't know, as a pharmacy student, I didn't realize the research that was coming out of Ontario. And it really kind of just proved to me the power. Like here I was, a study coming out of Toronto, Canada. I was all the way deep in Tennessee switching patients because of a finding there. And it kind of like, it opened my eyes to the power of research. I just got to say, like, it really, really shaped my career. And I don't know if I've ever got a chance to tell you that.
No, that's really, that's kind of nice to hear. Thanks, Mina. So there's a good example of a study idea that came from first principles.
Mm-hmm.
And for it's a controversial interaction. Do you want me to unpack it?
Let's walk through it. Like I want to.
Yeah. So clopidogrel, everyone knows, is an antiplatelet drug. Clopidogrel itself doesn't actually do anything. It's a prodrug that's converted into its active metabolite. And the enzyme that does that, the CYP enzyme, is cytochrome P450-2C19. So CYP2C19 takes clopidogrel, turns it into the active metabolite that, typically in combination with aspirin in patients with a variety of cardiac issues, can reduce the risk of recurrent cardiac events by, it depends on the study and depends on the indication, but the absolute risk reduction between 1% and 3%. So it's not a huge effect size. So that's the basis
right.
of clopidogrel's effectiveness. This particular study arose because of some in vitro data and some volunteer studies that suggested that omeprazole, which at the time was the commonest PPI in widespread use, could interfere with CYP2C19. So in theory, our hypothesis going into this was that, if people are taking omeprazole with clopidogrel, and they very often were because they were on aspirin as well, maybe this is interfering with the effectiveness of a pretty important medication that's taken by millions of people. And so we were able to tease this out we published it in CMAJ, as you said, but one of the things that was really helpful in that study was showing that pantoprazole, which has no inhibitory effect on CYP2C19, didn't seem to have the same sort of signal. And so I don't want to get into the weeds on the study, but the point is we were able to show in that study that that PPI use, and specifically non-pantoprazole PPI use, was associated with an increased short-term risk of cardiovascular events. And so it's, as I say, it's been controversial. There have been studies that have come out in favor of and against that one, but it's a testament to two things. One is the value of a a novel idea, because we were the first people to study this issue. About 3 weeks later, a paper came out in JAMA that showed more or less the same thing. It also shows the potential for observational studies, real-world studies, to actually sometimes influence practice. And it's still the case that Panto is the number one PPI, I think, and it's got something to do, I think, with that paper.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, it also showed like how often the power of observational studies in shaping practice, but also that many times like people took for granted that omeprazole, which was considered a relatively safe medication, could on a population level really be impacting things. So with that as a tangent, so we've talked a little bit about the place of observational research. When you think about drug safety, where does observational research in your mind fit into where RCTs do? Because, for some people, RCTs are branded as the way that we prove that a drug is safe and effective. But yet we're hearing stories about things happening, these are happening after the drug is out in the market. Can you walk us through that kind of relationship between RCTs, observational research, when thinking about drug safety?
So it's not the case that RCTs show that a drug is safe. I mean, they do have some informative value, but RCTs and observational studies are complementary. Most people have seen some sort of incarnation of this evidence pyramid, with at the top of the pyramid randomized trials and systematic reviews of randomized trials, and at the bottom of the pyramid, expert opinions and animal studies, but somewhere around there, case reports and case series, and in between case reports and case series and randomized trials are observational studies, case control, cohort, self-match designs, ecological analyses. The randomized trials are irreplaceable as a way of knowing whether a drug can do something, right? Mm-hmm. And I know you've talked about them in your podcast before, but just super quickly, if you have two otherwise comparable groups of people and you intervene, you give a drug to one group and not the other, and you follow them forward in time, and there's some measurable difference in outcomes, if the two groups were really comparable and nothing else happened, no other co-interventions happened, you can reasonably attribute any difference in outcomes, good or bad, to the drug. And so observational studies are not a good way of telling whether a drug works or not. Certainly case reports and case series aren't either. But there are many reasons why a randomized trial, as good as it might be for establishing the efficacy of a drug, is not good for telling us about the safety of a drug. And that's where the real world studies come in, the observational studies. And I'll just touch on a couple of these. The randomized trials they don't tend to have millions of people. They might have a few hundred or a few thousand, or in their larger incarnations, 10 or 20,000. They don't go for years at a time. In most instances, they go for a few months or maybe a few years. They are very careful in the patients they enroll and the patients they exclude. And so we don't apply those same criteria in the real world, right? And for rare drug side effects, things that might happen once in every 5 or 10,000 patients, there's no randomized trial on the planet that's going to pick that kind of thing up. You need large populations to pick up rare adverse effects. So I would say that randomized trials and observational studies are complementary, and they each can inform our understanding of drugs in different ways. I mean, there are people out there who just have complete disdain for anything observational. It has to be a randomized trial or nothing, and that's really, really myopic. Randomized trials, as I said before, if you want to know if something works, with rare exception, randomized trials are the way to go. But there are just some times when they're not feasible or not ethical, and you have to rely on non-randomized designs. It's very easy to do observational studies poorly. I know because I've done them poorly.
Yeah.
It's really all about finding the right question, answering it in a thoughtful way that complements what is already known from RCTs, and is mindful of the limitations of the data you're using. And I think that's probably one other way in which I hope observational epidemiology around drug safety will evolve, where people ask fewer questions, that are of dubious importance,
Yeah.
or they become more rigorous with their designs.
Yeah, absolutely. And observational studies have become our first and last line of drug safety, right? If you think about the Sentinel program and what the FDA is doing, it's realizing that we have to actively monitor how safe drugs are. And if we waited for the RCTs to figure it out, it would never be feasible. These trials would have to be 100,000 people. It would just be, we would never get a treatment.
Get done.
Yeah.
Or they wouldn't get done.
Absolutely.
I mean, like OxyContin and related drugs are on the market, approved for chronic pain based upon relatively small RCTs that don't go for more than a few months.
Yeah.
And, and they're compared against placebo, for God's sake.
Yeah.
So anyway, there's all kinds of ways in which pharma companies can kind of game the system, and we need observational studies to help as a counterweight and to really inform medical practice and help patients decide whether or not they should be, committing to drug therapy.
Absolutely. I was always kind of surprised when I would walk through with patients on the risk and benefit of a drug. So you could tell them the benefit of something is 50% in lowering their cholesterol. I would have this conversation about statins all the time. And then you would tell them a side effect that can happen in 1 in 5,000 people. And to me, if you just put that into a ratio, seems like the numbers were pretty good, even if you told them the number of people that needed to treat. So for every 100 patients, you're going to get 1 less heart attack. And yet the risk seems to overshadow the benefits from a patient's perspective. And a large number of patients choose not to, or were very hesitant to take the medications. Why do you think that is? Why does risk overshadow benefits so greatly?
What's partly the framing. In that instance you just gave, in that example, first of all, they're taking a drug that isn't for an immediate benefit. It's for a long-term benefit. And they might actually, it's one thing to lower your cholesterol. We don't care about that. What we care about is not having vascular events, right?
Right.
I mean, I won't say we don't care, but the reason I'm not on a statin right now, but if I were to go on a statin, it would not be so my number is lower. It would be so I live longer, or I have a better quality of life. I skip the MI or stroke that I'm otherwise destined to have at 75. So you got in that instance, you got a long frame, and it might be a problem that you don't have even without taking the drug, or you do have even despite taking the drug. But the harm side of things, people are risk averse. This is, an even more contemporary example is vaccines. For COVID, and so lots of people are misinformed, but they have this perception that the vaccine is somehow not worth the risk because the disease itself is not terribly severe if they get it. So this is a long-winded answer to your question, but I think it all depends on the individual's motivation. If you had someone who was extremely health, and it probably depends on the side effect too.
Right.
So, it's a myalgia or some statin myopathy. Most people you can convince that, first of all, most people who think they've got muscle pain on statins have the same thing happen when they're given placebo in a controlled situation. It's just nocebo effect. But if you have it, you could stop it and it would go away. So the calculus really depends a lot on the nature of on the two sides of the equation. What am I expecting to get out of this drug, and in terms of benefits, and what are the potential harms, and how serious are they, and how common are they? So if you were, if the benefits were immediate and significant, you're much more likely to want to go along with what the health professional is advising you to do. If the harms are, minor or, consistently reversible or transient, you're going to be in that same boat. But if you say to me, listen, the risk of some horrible irreversible adverse event is 1 in 100 or 1 in 500. Those are dice that people just don't want to roll.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So I think it's very context dependent upon the drug in the question, and individuals' beliefs and preferences inform this, sometimes in ways that I think are hard to know.
Have you found better ways to communicate risk? Do you think we just do a poor job of communicating it as well?
I have to have these kinds of discussions with patients all the time about drugs and about procedures sometimes. So you really do have to let people know what the material risks of a drug are, right? So, and it's tough because, like, let's take an antibiotic. Let's take Septra, sulfamethoxazole trimethoprim, or Bactrim, depending where you're listening to this. But there's a drug that's been in existence for 50 plus years. It's extremely valuable in certain patients, but it's got a boatload of side effects, some of which can be lethal. And I don't know, it's just not practical to tell every single patient about the risk of toxic epidermal necrolysis with, or Stevens-Johnson syndrome, or, what have you. So I'm mindful of the fact that I'm talking around your question. The how you portray risk to the patient, I think it's very patient dependent, and there's no one right way to do it. But I think it always has to be couched in what the expected benefits are, and what not just the nature of the risks, but their approximate incidence to the extent that you know it, and reversibility. These are all kind of factors that play into the decision.
Risk benefit is complex and is highly dependent on good evidence. So who ensures we produce good evidence? I chatted with Dr. Gomes about this. I think one thing that's, I think public scrutiny has become really important on sort of these safety signals, and it's obviously heightened during the pandemic with the vaccines. Who's involved in this space, like this drug safety post-marketing surveillance? Like, is it the pharmaceutical companies funding all of this? Like, what's like, I think I kind of say this funny story where I was at a dinner table and someone was mentioning that that the pharmaceutical companies hide all this data on drug safety and will never find out about things because there's nobody independently studying it. As I was sitting at the table, and I kind of laughed to myself, like, so are there people independently studying this, and who else is involved in this of like the sort of post-marketing surveillance?
I would say that there are people who are studying these questions across all different domains, including industry and academia and policy. And given that, I would say that probably the largest amount of research that is done is outside of industry and is largely publicly funded and conducted by academic researchers who, like myself and you, have affiliations with universities and are really doing this because there is an academic and a population health reason and level of inquiry around what actually happens when these medications are rolled out. So, I think that there's a lot of really good work that is done by people internationally who have really excellent access to data. In our circumstance, with the data that we regularly access based out of ICES, which is a organization that houses health administrative data in Ontario, a lot of the legislation that really surrounds access to that data is predicated on us being independent researchers and not having conflicts of interest with for-profit companies like industry, so that we are able to make sure that the data that is being accessed and the work that is being done is as free from competing interests as possible.
And I try to tell people that the bias, and I know this all too well because I have the good luck of always having null findings, that the bias is actually that we want to, I hate to say this, but it's easier to publish a paper that has a safety signal. You'll get into a bigger journal than one that found that the drug was safe. And so, this it's actually the flip bias of what the company wants. And so I think there's a lot of people out there who are in a way hunting for results and making sure that things are studied very quickly and safely and in a robust way, which for me is always I think gives me confidence. I guess that where I'm leading with this is do you have confidence that as drugs enter the market, that their safety signals and things are being studied in a good way?
I do. I think that what's really important to also think about in that is that a lot of these safety signals will be consistent across international borders. And there are huge research groups internationally who do this kind of work. And so you'll often see that a safety signal is identified by a group in Europe, for example, and those results are largely generalizable and can be then replicated within Canada or the United States. And so I think that on a drug safety side, there's a lot of opportunity for research groups from around the world to be constantly searching, like you said, and looking for where there might be potential risk, because it is more publishable, but also an endeavor that many people want to undertake, which is to make sure that when people are accessing medicine and other health services, that it's being done as safely as possible. So I feel a lot of confidence that there are excellent academics and researchers, many of whom are also working closely with policymakers and regulators to identify what the emerging issues are, where there might be concerns, and trying to use real world data to explore those concerns and questions.
I asked Dr. Juurlink the same question. Who ensures we produce good evidence?
The launch of a drug onto the market is an experiment on the population, and what we learned from randomized trials may or may not be generalizable to the real world setting. And so it's sort of it's a collective effort. I mean, even community or hospital pharmacists or physicians in the front lines, like they are part of they're potentially part of the surveillance system. So, if a patient starts a new drug and a week later they're covered head to toe in some horrible rash and they've got, they come to hospital and they've got abnormal blood work and it looks like a drug reaction, it's incumbent, actually the law now, for the healthcare providers to report these things. So it's a bit of a group effort, I would say.
We know that companies in some scenarios have there's some black eyes for the pharmaceutical industry, right?
Purdue Pharma, or Urdu Karma.
Yeah, or whichever name that we want to say, or Vioxx, or Avandia, or Gadifloxacin. Yeah. There's a few. Mm-hmm. But when you think about the thousands of drugs that have been produced, the batting average of corruption and greed, I guess, is not that bad. And there's been a number of drugs that have been pulled from the market. There's been a number that we found signals and we know that are safe. And I'm notorious for finding studies where we think there's a signal and there ends up being nothing there either, right? So.
We've all done those.
Yeah. So in that infrastructure, do you think that points to I think, and then this was all obviously highlighted even more during the pandemic as people showed their cards about their belief and trust in the pharmaceutical industry and the regulators. Is the infrastructure that we have good enough, or should we be making trials larger? How do we solve this by ensuring that patients get the drugs that they need, but at the same time, understanding the risk that's behind them?
The system could always be improved. I mean, I think depending on the drug and depending on the jurisdiction, the answer will vary. But in Canada and the U.S., I think that things are reasonably robust. If people, there's always an element, especially with a new drug, an element of vigilance. Mm-hmm. Typically from skeptics in the community or academics like you and me and Tara, not perhaps as much as there should be from regulators. I mean, the FDA is a good example of this. I mean, the FDA, a lot of money at the FDA, first of all, comes from pharma to help get drugs on the market. And then there's a smaller portion, I think it used to be called, maybe still is called, the Office of Drug Safety, which is, in a way, it's kind of dueling with the Office of New Drugs. Again, that may be the old name of it, but so you can sort of automatically see there's a good example. Health Canada is a lot more inscrutable than the FDA, but here you have the bulk of the FDA, at least the perception is, doing its best to get new drugs to the market. Being paid, courtesy of PDUFA in the early 90s, by pharma to do this. And so in a way, they kind of view pharma as their customers. And then you have this other much smaller sort of group within the FDA that's in the business of trying to ferret out safety concerns after launch. Yeah. And of course, if they do find a safety concern, that looks kind of bad for the other part of the FDA. So conflicts like that are obviously not helpful. And I think there's certainly room for improvement. Just looking at our situation here in Ontario, it would be really great if we had drug utilization data on everybody, as opposed to people 65 and older and those on, ODB. It would be really great if we had better access to labs, and if we had, data that was available, in real time, that would allow us to tease these questions out. But I think that's a long-winded way of answering your question. It's a bit circuitous, but I think things are they're better than they might be, but they're not as good as they could be.
It became obvious that there was lots of different stakeholders throughout the process of studying drug safety. An important dynamic emerged between researchers and policymakers. I spoke with Dr. Gomes about this interesting dynamic. So you've brought it up a few times about working with policymakers and decision makers. And that's a very unique component, I think, of your body of work, is like how well integrated, especially your team is with policymakers. What has that experience been like? And how do you, I think everyone wants to feel like their work is important and like being used, but how have you sort of assured that? And what have been sort of the challenges of working with policymakers?
Yeah, and I guess I should have mentioned that as another very obvious path through which we identify research questions is working directly with policymakers. And for me, that has been really interesting because policymakers are those who are dealing with these new medications that are just, becoming approved by Health Canada, and they have to make decisions on how they're going to fund them and how accessible they'll be, and whether they need to place limitations on access or monitor outcomes or effectiveness or safety. And so being able to have that direct engagement with policymakers to hear what those concerns are that they are grappling with and where there are gaps that haven't been filled through clinical trials is hugely important to us. And it helps us really get a head start on a lot of work that perhaps hasn't quite percolated outside of that policy realm into the broader clinical realm yet. And it really provides us with exciting opportunities to take on studies that are really leveraging the newest information and the most novel medications that are just coming out, and really having a finger on the pulse of what matters at a provincial or a national level as it relates to new medications and how they're going to be provided at the population level.
How have you navigated the difference between working with policymakers and politics, and how things like, the winds of change? I think that's often a question that people ask, like, as governments change or leadership changes, has that been a challenge? And how do you adapt to, the sort of the different directions that things might go in when working with policymakers?
Yeah, that is something that we're always very aware of and I think carefully about. I think it's important to maintain your independence when working with policymakers and make sure that the infrastructure and framework within which you engage with them is one so that you're not put in a position of a conflict of interest. And so we make sure that those that all of those parameters are in place so that it's clear that we are hearing from them what they would like to have done, but that we are working completely independently on answering those questions. So I think that's one really important element. The other is recognizing that while political winds will change, a lot of the underlying questions often relate to having constrained budgets and wanting to provide access to, as many appropriate medications as possible within those constrained budgets. And regardless of the political party, those continue to be questions that arise, as well as making sure that they're not funding medications or making broadly available medications that are harming the population, obviously. So, while the specific perhaps clinical focus or topics may slightly change between governments, a lot of the underlying values and reasons for doing the work stay the same.
Have you ever had to deliver bad news to them? Or news they may not want to hear. Maybe bad news is like a like it must be like the findings that you have may not always align with what they were hoping to see.
Yeah, I
right?
mean they don't always, and a lot of the time they're not sure what they're going to see. So the bad news, good news is often they might be expecting the bad news. So I'm thinking about even just some of the cost work we've done in the past, looking at the way in which blood glucose test strips were funded and the high costs and some of the more recent work around biologics. And I think that policymakers know that these are, costly medications. And so some of the bad news might be expected, but part of it is how you also communicate that, right? So it's also about providing an idea of, what does this mean, or what might the opportunities be for addressing this, and trying to provide, pragmatic, tangible ideas for what this might mean, and what else you might be able to do to help them better understand what is driving whatever it is that you're seeing, so that you can help guide them towards how to remedy it.
Safety has become central in many debates around therapeutics, vaccines, and the complexities of understanding this risk-benefit is not straightforward. The whole infrastructure of ensuring the safety of drugs requires many key players to dynamically work together. Researchers, governments, and companies. And more importantly, ensuring all of them play nicely to get the public to trust the information that's being released. We heard about the independent scientists researching various different drugs. We also heard about the infrastructure and the type of research that's needed. As I think about an area that's obviously close to home for me, as it's my own research area, I think about where the future is going in this space. The move away from passive surveillance towards a more active surveillance using large data sets is essential to ensuring that any new product that's released is safe as well as being effective. But as we look for things more, we're going to find more signals, more than we've found before. So how do we communicate this in a way that's very understandable for the public and for all patients who are going to be taking any medications? And I think that's the core of some of the things we heard on this episode. Communicating risk-benefit, the complexity of it, and how not every scenario is the same as the last. To sum it up, we're doing okay, but we need to do better. This episode of the I'm Pharmacy podcast was produced by Steve Southon, Kate Richards, and me, Mina Tadrous. It was edited by Steve Southon with musical support from Steve Southon and Diego Martinez. Special thanks to Dr. Tara Gomes and Dr. David Juurlink. We'll be dropping new episodes every month, so be sure to subscribe to wherever you listen to podcasts. Keep asking questions, stay safe, and catch you next episode.